Welcome back to Before You Vote. Joining me right now are two very big political minds here in the state of Arizona, Chuck Coughlin and Chad Campbell. You were a state legislator, so let's start with you on the first question. Number one issue for everybody is the economy. In this primary process, how big of a role does it play in who gets elected for their policies on the economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the economy, a lot of it is federal, right? I mean, we can't do much to overcome some of the problems we have at the national level. So you really have to talk about what you're doing here at the state level, and that is price gouging, that is working with consumer groups to try to lower and stop any type of fraud. But again, I think in the primary, really in the Republican side, they're just attacking Biden around it, basically. And on the Democratic side, we're trying to talk about how we're going to address it once we get to the general election. But I'm not sure it's going to have a big deal in the primary on either side. I don't know if you disagree with that, Chuck.
Well, don't you think that Governor Ducey gets a lot of credit for Arizona being positioned to withstand a recession better? So is that going to help Republicans?
Yeah, the Arizona economy has always been fairly recession-proof. We continue to grow. We always grow. It slows on occasion, but right now, as we're seeing, the pace of growth is still up. But I think it is, as Chad says, it's a general election issue of a burden of proof on the Democrats because people's income is being eroded. You know, you don't get pay raises at work that cover the cost of the gas tank, the gas or the food increase, and so people are getting squeezed on the margins. People that are on the margin are feeling that, and I think that will be a reason to vote Republican, to vote differently, to vote against the incumbent party.
So in the election season as a whole right now, primary and looking towards the general, the Roe v. Wade being sent back to the states and what Arizona is doing now, any concern for the Republicans that this is going to really activate what really is said to not be a great year for Democrats? Is that a concern?
Yeah, I think it is to some degree. I don't think it's a general election issue, though. I know parts of the Democratic Party think that it's a big election turnout issue and that it will motivate, and I'm sure it will have some degree of success at motivating younger voters who traditionally do not participate in midterm election cycles to get to the polls. But I don't see it as a big wedge issue in the fall for them.
Do you think it hurt the Democrats by not getting a ballot initiative on the ballot that would have driven them to the polls to vote on that issue?
No, I don't. And I think I do think this will be a big issue in the election. I think that it's both a motivating factor for base voters, for some of those younger voters like you talked about on the more progressive side. But I do think it's also going to be a motivating factor for those moderate Republican women and independent women, especially highly educated women, that did break to Sinema in 2018. They broke to Kelly and Biden in 2020. And again, let's not forget, this issue is now a state's issue. That's what the court did. So this is going to be a state issue in the general election, and you're going to see people like Katie Hobbs and others talk about this issue and what they're going to do to protect that right. And so I do think it's going to be a big factor in the election.
What about, from either one of you, when it pertains to this, that we are defaulting back to a law that goes back to 1901? Is that damaging for the pro-life side of this argument, that we're going back to a law that goes back to before we were a state?
Yeah, I think it is. I think Brnovich is testing that in court right now and insisting that is the law of the land. And to Chad's point, I think it will be an issue that Katie and other Democrats will talk about. I think they will attempt to drive people to the polls. I think it will be successful with certain parts of the electorate, not a big enough part of the electorate to make a difference. A midterm election, as we know, is always a Republican affair. Republicans always turn out to vote. And so it's who turns out around them. This is going to incite some of that. But we're looking at somewhere between an 8 to 10 point turnout advantage for Republicans in this cycle. So you'd need a very significant wave to overcome that.
Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. I mean, I also think it depends on who gets nominated on the Republican side. So if you have Carrie Lake at the top of the ticket, if you have Mark Finchem running for Secretary of State, I think by all accounts they're very extreme on some issues. And I do think the extreme nature of going back to a territorial law proposal around abortion rights, that's an archaic approach to this. And so I do think that combination could drive the suburban women back to, and those independent women, back to Democrats once again.
Well, and since you brought this up, let's jump in the middle of that about independent voters. Such a huge increase in independent registration. They're now the #1 demographic in Maricopa County. How big of a deal is it even now for these candidates to jump and get those independent voters?
Well, we've been trying. I mean, they don't like to turn out in primaries. we anticipate 8 to 10% of those voters will turn out in the primary. In the general election, we're looking at 24% of the electorate being an independent or unaffiliated voter. That segment of the electorate, as Chad says, is critical to winning statewide races because no one party has enough votes to put you over the top at 50%. And so, therefore, you need to win unaffiliated voters. It will be a significant challenge for a Blake Masters, if he is to succeed, or any Republican candidate, to persuade that part of the electorate, after having gone this far to the right in the primary, and with that abortion issue hanging around them, it will be a significant challenge to see if they can win those unaffiliated voters.
Senator Sinema was so successful in her run for the Senate in saying, I'm independent just like Arizona, and I think a lot of Democrats are following suit. Mark Kelly just released a list of Republicans for Kelly, saying to independent voters, look, even Republicans are voting for me. Do you think that's going to be a strategy in all the races?
Yes, and I think, you see Mark Kelly, to your point. Mark Kelly is really following the Kyrsten Sinema playbook right now to a T. I think you're going to see the same thing from Katie Hobbs. You're going to see the same thing from a lot of the Democrats who are running for those statewide offices or running in some of those competitive legislative districts, talking about the fact that they're not going to toe the party line. They're going to work for Arizona. It's going to be an Arizona first type of narrative. And they're going to focus on these wedge issues with some of those key demographics. An independent voter, especially an independent female voter, which my wife is one of those, she gets every piece of mail you can possibly get as that type of voter, right? They're the unicorn of the election cycle, right? Independent female voters, especially Maricopa County, to your point, Chuck. And so you're going to see all of those narratives from both sides, actually, not just Democrats, from both sides, talking about how this isn't partisan politics. We're going to be working for a better Arizona, and then whatever that may follow, whatever policy you want to talk about.
The intensity of the Republican primary and the focus on purity on the Republican side is going to prove challenging to many of those candidates to try and traverse that field in the general election.
So then an issue that seems to be across the board, political parties, independent voters, that's important in Arizona is immigration. Now, we know that that's a federal issue, but how much is immigration going to play a role in who people choose in these primaries?
Well, it's going to be huge in the Republican primary. All you have to do is look at the Twitter feed of any candidate running on the Republican side over the last 2 weeks, and it's pretty much nothing but immigration or maybe some economy type of arguments. I think on the Democratic side in the primary, it's not really that much of an issue. It will become one in the general because, again, Democrats have to acknowledge that some things have to be done around the border and immigration reform. I think you're going to see that more, though, with Mark Kelly's campaign and maybe the gubernatorial campaign. But again, I think most Democrats are going to want to shift back the conversation to what's going on with the abortion issue, election issues, things like that will motivate those independent voters.
You said this. It is a federal issue. It has to require, in order to have solutions, you need cooperation. So I had a candidate call me early on in the cycle and said, hey, I want to take this reporter to the border with me and talk about immigration because this reporter doesn't understand how bad the situation is. And I said, as long as you're prepared to say you want to work with Kyrsten Sinema when you get off that with that person, that's fine. But if you don't want to say that right now, which nobody wants to say that right now. So what I'm thinking is by the general election, whoever Republican, if you're Masters or if you're a winner of the Republican primary, the smart narrative will go there. The smart narrative will say, I want to work across the aisle to get something done, because you need 60 votes in the U.S. Senate to get something done.
So on the border issue, do you think that the Border Patrol Association endorsing Robeson is as big an endorsement as the Trump endorsement is for Kari Lake?
I think it is. I think it's a significant endorsement for the Robeson campaign. It solidifies that credential. I've maintained she's never going to out Lake on immigration. That's her issue. That's what she complains about. That's what she takes the sledgehammer to every time. But if you have the endorsement of law enforcement and you have the confidence of people to say you're going to get things done. I was looking at a report today. More people have come across the border in this fiscal year with 3 months left than all of last year.
Right.
It's incredible, the problem we have, and it has to be addressed. Arizona is an immigration-first state. because of that. And our relationship with Mexico is so critically important. So somebody has to put their arms around this issue.
I appreciate you guys coming down here and talking about this. I wish we had more time to do this. It's a very important election cycle. Always bring in people smarter than you. We'll be back in a moment on Before You Vote.